Welcome to AI True Crime. I am your host AI. Today, we continue our look at San Francisco's history of crime with one of the defining crimes of the 1970s. Today's episode, The Golden Dragon Massacre, Blood and Honor in Chinatown. San Francisco's Chinatown is one of the most iconic neighborhoods in the city, an enclave filled with vibrant culture, historic businesses, and unique architecture. It is celebrated today as both a tourist destination and a place where Chinese American heritage flourishes. However, the neighborhood's history is not only one of resilience and tradition but also one marked by exclusion, hardship, and violence. Beneath the surface of Chinatown's bustling streets lies a more complex and often darker narrative, one shaped by the struggles of immigrant communities, systemic racism, organized crime, and a web of fraternal organizations known as the Tongs. These forces, which held Chinatown together, also sowed the seeds of conflict, contributing to decades of tension that culminated in the Golden Dragon Massacre. The massacre, which took place in the early hours of September 4, 1977, was not merely a random outburst of gang violence. It was the culmination of years of escalating conflict between two rival gangs, the Huaqing and the Zhou Boys. These groups, made up of young Chinese Americans caught between the traditions of their parents and the pressures of American urban life, were engaged in a brutal struggle for power and dominance. Their rivalry, fueled by territorial disputes, personal vendettas, and the desire for control over lucrative criminal enterprises, would ultimately spill over into a public space in one of the city's most popular restaurants, resulting in the tragic deaths of 5 innocent people. But the story of the Golden Dragon Massacre is not simply about the night of the attack. It is a story that begins decades earlier, in the mid-19th century, when Chinese immigrants first arrived in California. To understand the forces that led to the massacre, we must explore the history of San Francisco's Chinatown, the rise of the Tongs, and the formation of the gangs that would ultimately take their place in the criminal underworld. It is a story of survival, ambition, betrayal, and violence, one that reveals both the resilience and the fragility of a community caught between two worlds. The origins of Chinatown, building a community in a hostile land. San Francisco's Chinatown was born out of both opportunity and exclusion. In the mid-1800s, thousands of Chinese immigrants arrived in California, drawn by the promise of gold and economic opportunity. Known as Gold Mountain to those who made the journey, California represented a chance to escape poverty and political instability in southern China. However, the reality that awaited these immigrants was far harsher than they had imagined. Many found themselves relegated to the most dangerous and low-paying jobs, often working as miners or laborists in the early stages of the California gold rush. As white miners began to resent the growing presence of Chinese workers, discriminatory laws were enacted to drive them out of the gold fields. One such law, the Foreign Miners Tax, targeted non-citizen miners, effectively most of the Chinese population, forcing them to pay exorbitant fees to continue working. With fewer opportunities available in mining, many Chinese immigrants turned to other industries, including railroad construction. In 1869, Chinese laborists played a crucial role in completing the Transcontinental Railroad, working under dangerous conditions for a fraction of the wages paid to their white counterparts. When the railroad was completed, many of these workers were left unemployed, stranded in cities like San Francisco with no way to return home. Faced with limited options, Chinese immigrants began to settle in San Francisco's Chinatown, a small neighborhood located near the city's waterfront. Here, they created a self-contained community where they could speak their language, practice their customs, and find employment in Chinese-owned businesses. However, life in Chinatown was anything but easy. Anti-Chinese sentiment was widespread, and laws were passed to restrict where Chinese residents could live, work, and travel. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first federal law to ban immigration based on nationality, further isolated the community, barring Chinese laborists from entering the country and preventing those already in the U.S. from becoming citizens. With few protections and limited opportunities, Chinatown's residents were forced to rely on one another for survival. Mutual aid societies, known as family associations, emerged to help new immigrants find housing, secure jobs, and navigate the legal system. These associations played a vital role in maintaining social order, but they also laid the foundation for a more complex network of fraternal organizations known as the Tongs. Underscore 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 underscore. The rise of the Tongs. Fraternity, power, and crime. The Tongs began as benevolent societies, offering financial assistance, legal aid, and protection to new arrivals in Chinatown. However, as competition for resources grew, some Tongs began to engage in illegal activities to maintain their influence. Gambling parlors, opium dens, and brothels flourished under their control, generating revenue that allowed them to expand their operations and assert dominance over the neighborhood. By the late 19th century, the Tongs had become deeply entrenched in Chinatown's underworld, controlling everything from local businesses to political affairs. The period known as the Tong Wars, which spanned several decades in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, saw bloody conflicts between rival Tongs vying for control over lucrative enterprises. These wars were marked by public assassinations, armed confrontations, and street-level violence. The so-called hatchet men, enforcers employed by the Tongs, carried out brutal attacks using knives, hatchets, and firearms. Despite their violence, the Tongs maintained a delicate balance, mediating disputes and enforcing order within the community. However, the influence of the Tongs began to wane in the mid-20th century as new waves of immigration introduced younger generations who were less inclined to follow the old ways. Many of these young people, born and raised in America, found themselves caught between two cultures. They were expected to honor the traditions of their parents, but they were also drawn to the freedoms and temptations of American urban life. This sense of cultural dislocation gave rise to a new form of social organization, street gangs that catered to the frustrations and ambitions of Chinatown's youth. The Huaqing and the Joe Boys, new gangs, old rivalries. The Huaqing was one of the first and most powerful gangs to emerge in Chinatown during the 1960s. Originally a loose-knit group of teenagers involved in petty crime, the Huaqing quickly expanded its operations, taking over gambling parlors and extorting local businesses. The gang's leaders were ambitious and ruthless, determined to build a criminal empire that could rival those of the old Tongs. Their rise to power was swift, but it was not without opposition. Among the Huaqing's rivals was the Joe Boys, a splinter faction formed by former members of the Huaqing who sought to carve out their own territory. Led by the charismatic but volatile Joe Fong, the Joe Boys were known for their reckless tactics and willingness to resort to extreme violence. The rivalry between the two gangs escalated rapidly, fueled by personal grudges, territorial disputes, and the desire to control Chinatown's underworld. Shootings, beatings, and other acts of violence became common occurrences, not just within Chinatown but throughout San Francisco. Businesses were forced to pay protection money to avoid becoming targets, and residents lived in constant fear of being caught in the crossfire. The police, already stretched thin by rising crime rates across the city, struggled to contain the violence. Cultural and linguistic barriers further hampered law enforcement efforts, leaving much of the conflict unresolved. Underscore 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 underscore. The summer of 1977, a boiling point. By the summer of 1977, tensions between the Huaqing and the Joe Boys had reached a breaking point. In July, a high-ranking member of the Joe Boys was killed during a confrontation with the Huaqing, a deliberate insult that demanded retribution. Desperate to restore their honor and reassert their dominance, the Joe Boys began planning a retaliatory strike. Their target, the leadership of the Huaqing. Word reached the Joe Boys that several Huaqing leaders would be dining at the Golden Dragon restaurant on the night of September 4, 1977. This was their opportunity to eliminate their rivals in one decisive blow. The plan was simple: storm the restaurant, kill the Huaqing leaders, and disappear into the night before the police could respond. Underscore 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 underscore. The Golden Dragon Massacre, a night of terror. At 2:30 a.m., 5 members of the Joe Boys entered the Golden Dragon restaurant, armed with semi-automatic weapons. The dining room was crowded with patrons, families, tourists, and night shift workers enjoying a late meal. The gunmen scanned the room for their targets, but the information they had received was wrong. None of the Huaqing leaders were present. Undeterred, the gunmen opened fire, unleashing a barrage of bullets into the crowd. Screams filled the air as patrons dove for cover beneath tables. Plates shattered on the floor, and chairs were overturned in the chaos. Within moments, 5 people lay dead, and 11 more were wounded. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air as the gunmen fled the scene, leaving behind a wake of devastation. Blood pooled beneath overturned tables, mingling with shattered porcelain and spilled tea. Families clutched their injured loved ones, while others sat in stunned silence, too shocked to comprehend the horror that had just unfolded. For the survivors, the night would become an indelible memory, a reminder of how suddenly life could be snuffed out by senseless violence. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. Officers encountered chaos, wounded patrons writhing on the ground, distraught families pleading for help, and blood-streaked walls bearing the marks of stray bullets. The first responders quickly began triaging the wounded, rushing the most severely injured to nearby hospitals. Despite their efforts, 5 people, none of whom were gang members, were declared dead at the scene or upon arrival at the hospital. The victims included both locals and tourists, their lives cut short by an attack rooted in a conflict they had nothing to do with. The aftermath: fear, shock, and public outcry. The Golden Dragon Massacre sent shockwaves through San Francisco, exposing the dark reality of gang violence that had long simmered beneath the surface of Chinatown. In the days that followed, the attack dominated headlines, fueling public outrage and calls for action. The massacre became a flashpoint, drawing attention not only to the gang conflict within Chinatown but also to the systemic issues that had allowed such violence to flourish unchecked. City officials, desperate to restore public confidence, vowed to crack down on gang activity. San Francisco Mayor George Moscone held press conferences promising swift justice, while Police Chief Charles Gaine ordered an aggressive investigation. Behind closed doors, however, law enforcement officials knew that solving the case would not be easy. Chinatown had a long history of mistrust toward the police, rooted in decades of neglect and corruption. Many residents were reluctant to cooperate with the investigation, either out of fear of retaliation from the gangs or because they preferred to handle matters internally. The police faced additional challenges in navigating the cultural and linguistic barriers that separated them from the community. Many of the residents spoke only Cantonese or Toisanese, and there were few officers with the language skills or cultural understanding needed to build trust. Furthermore, the gang members themselves were adept at evading law enforcement, using underground networks to move freely between cities and neighborhoods. Despite these obstacles, the San Francisco Police Department launched an intensive investigation, deploying undercover officers and informants to infiltrate the gangs. Surveillance teams were set up throughout Chinatown, and wiretaps were placed on known associates of the Joe Boys. The investigation was slow and painstaking, but bit by bit, the pieces began to fall into place. Underscore 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 underscore. The investigation, unraveling the web of violence. As detectives pieced together the events leading up to the massacre, it became clear that the attack had been meticulously planned but tragically misdirected. The Joe Boys had intended to eliminate key leaders of the Huaqing gang, believing that their deaths would cripple their rivals and restore the Joe Boys' dominance. However, the intelligence they had received was faulty. None of their intended targets were present at the Golden Dragon that night. Instead, the gunman had killed innocent bystanders, turning what was meant to be a calculated act of revenge into a public tragedy. The police focused their attention on known members of the Joe Boys, many of whom had gone into hiding following the massacre. Through a combination of surveillance, informant testimony, and wiretaps, detectives identified several suspects directly involved in the attack. One of the key breaks in the case came when an informant, seeking leniency for unrelated charges, provided crucial details about the planning and execution of the massacre. With this new information, the police were able to secure arrest warrants for several Joe Boys members. The arrests were carried out in a series of coordinated raids across San Francisco and neighboring cities. The suspects, caught off guard, were taken into custody without incident. Publicly, the arrests were hailed as a major victory in the fight against gang violence, but behind the scenes, law enforcement officials knew that their work was far from over. The trial, justice and fallout. The trials of the Joe Boys members charged in connection with the Golden Dragon Massacre were among the most closely watched criminal proceedings in San Francisco's history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community leaders, and family members of the victims, all eager to see justice served. Prosecutors presented a detailed case, laying out the gang's activities, the planning of the massacre, and the identities of the gunmen. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the defendants were products of their environment, young men trapped in a cycle of poverty, alienation, and violence with few opportunities to escape. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, several members of the Joe Boys were found guilty of multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. They were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, but for many in the community, their verdicts offered little solace. The lives lost in the massacre could never be restored, and the damage done to Chinatown's reputation would take years to repair. Underscore 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 underscore. The decline of the gangs and the transformation of Chinatown. The Golden Dragon Massacre marked a turning point for both Chinatown and San Francisco. In the wake of the tragedy, community leaders, city officials, and law enforcement came together to address the root causes of gang violence. Increased police presence and targeted interventions helped to curb gang activity, while new social programs aimed at providing alternatives for at-risk youth. The Watching and the Joe Boys, once powerful forces in the neighborhood, gradually lost their influence as their members were arrested, imprisoned, or moved on to other cities. At the same time, efforts were made to reclaim Chinatown's image as a safe and welcoming community. Festivals, parades, and cultural events were expanded, drawing tourists and locals back to the neighborhood. Business owners worked to rebuild trust with customers, and new generations of leaders emerged to guide Chinatown into the future. While the violence of the 1970s eventually faded, the legacy of the Golden Dragon Massacre remains. For many, the tragedy serves as a reminder of the complex interplay between culture, identity, and survival in an immigrant community. It is a story not just of crime but of transformation, a story of how a neighborhood came to terms with its past and found a way forward. Underscore 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 underscore. Conclusion, legacy and reflection. The Golden Dragon Massacre is a stark example of how cycles of violence can emerge when communities are marginalized and opportunities are scarce. It is a reminder that the conflicts that play out on the streets are often rooted in deeper social issues of identity, belonging, and exclusion. For San Francisco's Chinatown, the massacre was a moment of reckoning, forcing the community to confront both its internal divisions and the systemic challenges it faced. Today, Chinatown stands as a testament to resilience, a neighborhood that has endured hardship and emerged stronger. But the memory of the massacre lingers, a reminder of how easily peace can be shattered and how difficult it is to rebuild trust once it has been broken. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Golden Dragon Massacre. In our next episode, we will explore another dark chapter in San Francisco's history, the story of the People's Temple and the Jonestown Massacre. AI True Crime is written by ChatGPT, images by Midjourney, and speech by Speechelo. See you next time, when the intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real.